Hi, and welcome to Untold Hong Kong Stories, multimedia narratives from the margins. This is a podcast series where we hear the stories of people in our community, from Hong Kong's non-Chinese locals to marginalized members of our community. We hope that by sharing their stories, we can think about the way we live, ours, and create a more inclusive and diverse society. For today's podcast, we are doing something special. It is a bonus edition of all of the group members who have normally taken the role of interviewers. But today we want to take this opportunity to reflect on the journey and how we got here. So I'd like to invite you to jump in and tell us the story of how you got to this moment.
Hi everyone, this is Marija Todorova. And I'm pleased to be here today, sharing my thoughts about this collaborative project on marginalized voices in Hong Kong. I've always felt passionate about highlighting untold stories and bringing unheard perspectives to light. I'm glad to have collaborated with such a talented group of people, of interdisciplinary researchers, to conduct the interviews of 10 individuals from marginalized communities across Hong Kong. We spoke to different individuals from diverse backgrounds, from ethnic minorities to differently abled youth, but my main focus is on refugees and asylum seekers. As a researcher, I feel a deep sense of connection and commitment to refugees. Earlier in my career, I worked extensively as an interpreter in refugee camps, and I witnessed directly the trauma, the hardship, and the limbo these people endured because they were forced to flee violent events and persecution. Also, my native country has opened its borders to asylum seekers at least 2 different occasions. In 2001, as a result of the Kosovo conflict, and then again in 2015 during the so-called European refugee crisis. So in both these situations, very often asylum seekers and refugees were being framed by media narratives within discourse of face claims, abusing the system, involved in criminal activities and so forth. And I think we've seen this across different countries as well. At the same time, some of my closest friends have been displaced as refugees of war and conflict, and their struggles and their profound resilience has deeply affected me. So that's why I brought this passion here to Hong Kong, where I worked with refugee and asylum seekers. Right, on a more personal note, I just want to add that this project closely aligns with my own background as an immigrant in Hong Kong. I needed to navigate challenges of displacement and emplacement. And that has drawn me to exploring themes of identity, marginality, and the quest of belonging. So I empathize deeply with the struggles faced by minority groups and strongly believe that sharing our own individual stories can serve as, if I can use a bit of a cliche metaphor, building bridges, right? And understanding communities.
Yeah, I think you bring about a really good point, especially in today's polarized times. Migrants, displaced people are often painted in a particular way in the media, in people's consciousness. So telling different stories, telling alternative stories, and speaking from a different perspective helps us discover the diversity and the multiplicity in all of these situations. And I wonder what it's like for example, other groups of marginalized populations that you have worked with.
Hello, this is Clara Yu from the Department of Translation, Interpreting and Intercultural Studies. One of the minority groups that my research focuses on is ethnic minorities, in particular South Asians in Hong Kong. It's very interesting that I would really like to share some of the personal experiences as to how I started to pay attention to marginalized groups in my research. One of the motivations that drives me in my research is really my curiosity about people. My principal discipline is translation studies, and it has a tradition of focusing on things, materials, as in the translated materials, rather than the agencies, the social actors playing a part in shaping up the translated materials, which bridges cultures and languages. Since my own PhD studies, I have been focusing on ordinary citizens who deploy language and translation as tools for self-expression, representation, and empowerment. So prior to studying multilingualism and multiculturalism involving South Asians in Hong Kong, my project has been about online collaborative translation, which was engaged by volunteers to represent themselves and to make use of their linguistic repertoire to express themselves and to fight for social agendas. So back to why that links to research ethnic minorities, South Asians in Hong Kong, is that I myself perhaps is an ordinary citizen, which I see myself, who travels around the world and is a migrant myself. And I have been feeling being central, more marginalized or peripheral as I lived in different parts of the world, including mainland China, Hong Kong, the UK, the US, Australia. And this marginalization and minority can be, sometimes you reflect on it from different perspectives. Is it linguistically? As an academic, English is not my native language, whereas it's my professional language. But in life, in being in Hong Kong, linguistically, the dominant language is Cantonese. And while living in Melbourne, which is in a country which doesn't even have an official language, that really brings to the fore and also to make me think what it means to be central and what it means to be a minority citizen in Hong Kong, in the world. As my research involves translation technologies such as machine translations, in which we talk about low resource and high resource languages, and the populations and the ordinary citizens who speak what we call minority languages, is lack of the de facto national language is even more marginalized, underprivileged when it comes to the use of technologies and translation technologies, especially in crisis situations. So that's how my new research project and research focus came about.
So speaking about feeling like a foreigner or feeling like a traveler, the community you work with, South Asians in Hong Kong, some of them are very much born and bred in Hong Kong, but made to feel like foreigners. And there's also another group of community who are very much part of the fabric of Hong Kong and yet always treated as outsiders. And Emily, what's your work?
Right. So I'm Emily Chow-Quesada from the Department of English Language and Literature. So my primary research focus is actually on post-colonial literature, specifically on African literature and also Hong Kong literature. But a few years ago, also stepped into the field of looking at representations of Blackness in Hong Kong, which is in a way also what brought me into this group and, this project. I don't really have a very interesting, anecdote because I'm born and raised here. But what I could share is, so my PhD research is also focused on a Zimbabwean writer called Dambuso Marija. So what is really interesting is that when I talk to my friends and families about, what I'm working on and what I plan to work on, was the very first reaction where, why on earth are you working on, African literature, something that seems to be so distant from Hong Kong, and what is really sort of shocking is also how many stigmas that still exist across generations. It's not just, sort of the older generation, but also even younger generation. So that is, I think that would be the sort of trigger that pushes me to, instead of just looking at, representations of, these marginalized people in Hong Kong, but what could we do more further in order to sort of improve, quote unquote, that situation? So I think that would be basically the push that I have for this particular project. And from my point of view, I mean, another very interesting point is that I sort of relate to would also be the fact that, I'm born and raised here. So basically I'm the majority in a nutshell. But to some extent, I do see and witness and feel some kind of marginalization, which is something that maybe we can talk about that later. Born and raised in Hong Kong, I have no idea about anything, basically, about the, for example, African continent throughout my whole life until I was in grad school. So in a way, when we talk to our students, I think that is still very much the case that, a lot of the narratives that they hear from media, now from social media, that, everyone is a citizen journalist, as the phrase goes. They could create their stories, which is great. But the problem would also be the fact that the stories are not really read critically, are not narrated critically. And it's not really digested critically as well. So I think what is so important to me for this particular project will also be this sense of more, critical perspectives towards the stories that we hear, and also the stories that are not told from a critical perspectives yet.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. The multiple voices and the multiple stories also offers different takes on what the problem is and where the problem lies. And I think this is, in a way, how academia can bring a certain perspective to the situation. It illuminates perhaps systemic problems that are not necessarily, the responsibility does not lie on the individual, but rather in the system. And how we respond to these systemic injustice is also a key point, and never forgetting the humanized or the human behind the systems. So how do you feel about your project and how academia can bring these ideas and critical perspectives to the general public?
Hi, I'm François Mouillot from the Department of Humanities and Creative Writing. And perhaps I will start with the personal, simply because I feel that it informs the way that I came to this project and how I approached this project as well. So I was born and raised in France in an ethnically diverse community, primarily lower working class. And I have a physical disability, which has been with me, or that I've lived with for as long as I can remember. So from the very beginning, as long as I can remember, really, I've sort of directly or indirectly reflected on what it means to be on the margins or being a minority in different ways, in different contexts. Of course, I grew up in France, but then I moved to Canada before I moved here to Hong Kong. So I've also experienced these kinds of displacements that colleagues have brought up already. So that's sort of all of these experiences folded into my greater interest, I think, in thinking about how different people can be marginalized, why that means for them, what are the struggles, what are the potentialities that come with those different positions of being a minority or a marginalized person or group. So that's sort of my background. One of the things that interests me the most at the moment, and which I try to bring to the project as well, is some of the lessons that I've taken from my own experience, primarily through disability and working in the field of disability studies. Specifically, one of the questions that I'm interested in is how being disabled and potentially marginalized can lead to some sort of productive moments or situations. That is to say, and this is where maybe it gets tricky or a little bit hairy, is that oftentimes being a minority or being marginalized comes with a lot of struggles, a lot of difficulties, and those are to be understood, analyzed, hopefully addressed or redressed. At the same time, I feel that, at least personally, the various ways in which I've been marginalized has created my identity in a way that has been unique, that has been, to use that word, I don't want to say positive, but I want to say productive. And that has been one of my personal as well as scholastic interest, is the ways in which marginalization can lead to productive subjectivities and experiences. So that's what I've been trying to bring to this project as well, working with Danny, whom I interviewed for the podcast series. I feel in a way that he reflects on his own ethnicity as a musician in Hong Kong, sort of speaks to the ambiguities about the difficulties as well as the productivity of being on the margins in some way, and how being on the margins of the music industries also is a fluid kind of experience. He talks about how basically in a way he's not always ostracized, but not always necessarily struggling. I think those particular moments are also worth reflecting.
Can I just add a couple of words there? Because I also want to add this point that we wanted to highlight in our podcasts, right? The resourcefulness and creativity of the individuals in these groups that we brought to the floor. So demonstrating how they keep their sense of community despite their marginalization through creative expression. And that will include sometimes music, sometimes literature, sometimes cooking even. So making food in creative ways, right? So this creativity serves as a source of solidarity and empowerment for these groups as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, race and class are often identifiers, but our identities are never fixed, and it's always multiple and fluid. And our experiences of borders are always different. The same border cuts differently through different groups. And I guess that's also very much coming through in some of your stories, the stories that you have told. Tell us a bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Daisy. Hi, I'm Evelyn Kwok. I'm from the Academy of Visual Arts. On this point that François was just, speaking on about it being productive, when we think about marginalization, we often think, unfortunately, with a lot of merit, that we think of the worst things and people suffering, and obviously those things are all true and valid. And then there's this other part, right, where we're talking about creativity, we're talking about celebrating identity in a way that can cultivate empowerment, can cultivate a kind of community. And I think, when I chose to speak to Isan for the podcast, she's a good friend, and I've known her in terms of her, from the background of being a Burmese cook and all of that that's not her, living, but, that's what she does all the time. And that's how I've known her as, and I've never thought about her as a marginalized or a minority until I think during the military coup that happened at the beginning. It was brought to sort of like that everybody sitting around the table might be chit-chatting and having their own kind of, the similarities that we all think are, oh yeah, we expect the same of, but she's actually holding on to a really big burden, and that she can only experience because she is a minority here. And that, and we joke that there's probably only like 500 Burmese people in Hong Kong or something like that. When I approach her to talk about being a minority, she doesn't really identify as such, but she understands that, yes, there is a lack of community in that way that would understand through language or common ways of growing up that she would if she was majority. And so, pivoting from that kind of, I guess, heaviness, then it's like, what do we do to celebrate? And I think, with her, food is so important as an expression and something that a lot of people bond over when they're a migrant. I guess it's kind of strange. I find it strange to say that I'm an immigrant, but I mean, I was born and raised in Hong Kong, but I also grew up in Australia for most of my life. So being an immigrant growing up in Australia, that gives me a different experience. And yes, I do see myself as a minority when I'm in Australia. However, being in Hong Kong, there's a sense of shape-shifting as well that happens when you're a foreigner, but you're not a foreigner, but then you kind of can blend in as an expat because you speak English with an accent that everyone goes, oh, it's so interesting. It's not American. It's like, oh yeah, I'm Aussie. And then depending on, the feedback. But I mean, yeah, I guess the point is that it's nice to also bring forward in this podcast, in this project, to celebrate the individuality and the community building, expressions of community building in Hong Kong. Yeah, I just would like to catch up on, Evelyn's point about visibility. I think that's something that we sort of touched on just now, but then we didn't really dig into it. I think that's also a really important takeaway I got from the project as well. David, Justin, and Frederick are people that I interviewed in the podcast. Justin and Frederick, in terms of the way they look, you wouldn't really regard them as, marginalized or minority in a way, but they are. Go back to those episodes if you're interested in their stories. But then, but I think that's a very important point that we have certain definitions about, what marginalization means, but just like identity, the fluidity that we see in that concept. Marginalization is also very fluid and yet to define, concept. And also, something that is very much have to be, contextualized to some extent, depending on, the context that we're looking at, the people that we're looking at, and very much individualized experiences that we have to focus on. And I also like to echo on this is how they are going to make their stories heard and make their stories impactful. Not only, just sharing the story, but also, literally impacting, creating influences to the future generation. So I think despite, all of the class, race, in a way, intersectionality that we have been, talking about for months indeed, what we can also see from these stories would also be a really strong sense of resilience, making themselves visible, making their stories visible, and also making their power visible as well.
The point that Evelyn was making about all these shape-shifting, which was one of the ideas that we used in the earlier days of this project, was our attempt to describe multiple ways in which people use their creativity and what they have at their disposal, right? Whether it is social capital, whether it's cultural capital, whether it's financial capital. And we all seem to learn to do this somehow, right? Whether it is through our language, our accents, our ability or our different abilities, our backgrounds, our trainings, all of this sort of provide different ways in which we could sort of adapt and mold ourselves so that we then become part of a group, that we are able to open up a conversation. Yeah, resilience is one of those words that one hesitates because it's so overused and could sometimes be co-opted into very neoliberal sort of discourses. But in this particular series of podcasts, I believe we celebrate these different shape-shifting adaptabilities, individual creativity and strength. And so I wonder what would be your takeaways from having done this series of podcasts and listened to each other's stories.
I think one of the biggest takeaways is the idea of creating home and a sense of belonging. With Daisy, what you just said about, resilience is a term that can be co-opted into different, discourses. And yeah, it's true, like resilience can be interpreted in so many ways. And I think fundamentally, all of the interviewees, whether they struggled or had moments of trying to attempt to create a sense of home, they're all kind of ways of belonging or pathways to coming to belonging to being in Hong Kong or being with a community. I find with, for example, the second interviewee of mine, Slavica, she published a book based on her stories, her background of writing for the Croatian Herald when she was living in Australia. And that was her act of generating and cultivating a sense of belonging. And the fact that she now lives in Hong Kong and she published the book in Hong Kong, but it actually speaks of an experience from way, in a different country, in a different time, but it's still alive, because it's never stagnant, this sense of belonging that you continue to make and remake and continue to create for other people. You impact other people by talking about these stories and sharing these stories. So I think, the major takeaway for me in this project is the kind of amazing ways that people, the long-term, short-term ways that people take on to create this sense of belonging. And I think belonging is about safety. It's about friendship. It's about comfort. It's also about joy and celebration. And to have that, especially in a world right now with, like you said before, Daisy, we live in such a polarizing world and there are conflicts, big and small, happening everywhere. It's like to be able to have that rootedness, that sense of belonging, it's so important. It's not just important, but it's the air that we breathe, because if we don't belong, then we will always feel agitated or fearful or unsafe or anyway, I digress.
And it's intentional. I mean, and then it's chosen, right? Like these are also stories of agencies, people exercising their own intention of choosing their own quote unquote family as their chosen family, right? Like it might not be geographically where they were born, but, they have made a home through their conscious choice of association and communities.
Echoing Evelyn, one of the big takeaways from me as well, from the project, from all of the interviews, has to do with this notion of home and specifically perhaps Hong Kong as a place that can at times and cannot at other times foster a sense of home and of belonging. I think that came through definitely in my conversation with Danny. I mean, the way he phrased it, I felt was very strong. He said Hong Kong is a cemetery for dreams. Yet at the same time, he had a very positive kind of discourse about his experiences, about making it through the music industries in Hong Kong, as well as doing other things. So there was this real sort of contrasted take on Hong Kong as a place that is both extremely taxing for maintaining individuality or, creating a sense of belonging, but at the same time offering a number of different opportunities or pathways to doing this. I feel, and I don't want to speak for any other interview content, but I feel that this notion of, our participants grappling with Hong Kong as a place to make a home was a kind of a salient theme throughout.
I also echo what Evelyn and François mentioned, as well as what Emily just said. Another perspective or something else that I think all of us have touched upon is community, which is in relation to a sense of belonging. So, academically speaking, we have a variety of the definitions to community, and I think it needs to be contextualized. So what community means and what does it mean to belong to a community? There is imagined community from Anderson. Sorry that it gets too academic perhaps, but there is also political community, there is community of practice. But in the society more largely, we might refer to Hong Kong as the Hong Kong community. But what the Hong Kong community or society consists of and what every individual, for example, our interviewees have experienced, it really varies from person to person. So on the one hand, we have the collectivity of being a community, but also there is the individualism in the living. So one of the takeaways or one of the things that I learned from joining this research community, the team, is multiple or unlimited perspective that we may take, the angle we may approach the issue of sense of belonging and understanding of minority. More and more I realized that when I just started the project, one of the things I kept asking in my own writing and is that what it means to be ethnic minority, what it means to be minority. But in the project, so we have the minorities interviewees who are disabled. We have minorities in the gender community. So that is one takeaway. And the other is, I think, that the fluidity of the definition and the understanding of many things. The identity, who we are, and how it is shaped with people around us, and how it is also situational, who we are, and what we represent. It all varies and it shifts from time to time, from situation to situation.
So, looking forward, looking into the future, what do we want to do? Where do we want to take this?
I think in a way, going back to your questions about about major takeaway. Also, looking forward would also be how I'm indeed surprised in terms of how often we give free pass to different forms of violence. I'm not just talking about physical violence, but also violence in terms of language, violence in terms of system, as we have discussed before, but also the fact that how very often and how much of these violence have been normalized for a very long time, and making it invisible, making this sort of normal to a lot of people in the city, despite the fact that a lot of them actually also go through different sense of hardships. Like when we talk about marginalization, I think one of my major takeaways will also be the fact that the spectrum is actually not just about migrant, but also people of different kinds of marginalization, like the elderly, disabled people, like François mentioned, issues related to mental health, all these kinds of, different identities that they hold. But the fact is, very often these kind of situations is also in a way normalized and, sort of looped in a vicious circle because of the sense of indifference that we have, because they are not visible, in a way, but also the fact that we don't really care, honestly. We have lots of, fancy campaigns, posters. I'm not saying that they are not good. They are good intentions, but we have to go beyond those kind of, tokens, campaigns, slogans. So for me, my major takeaway and also looking forward will also be a lot have to be done. No matter it's just, within academia, but also, among the general public, a lot have to be done. And lots of those have to be done collaboratively.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. It's more than awareness that we are trying to push beyond, right? Like awareness is kind of the first level when we, as in academia, we have to write impact, write about our impact. The first layer is awareness. It's like, okay, well, what's beyond raising awareness? Or it's a pretty campaign, just as Emily, you're saying now, it's like, it's pretty, it's nice, it goes, and then what? As a group, we are creating a conference next, which will bring more than just Hong Kong-based scholars into the fold to explore and expand and, have this conversation to take it on to a more global stage. Yeah, I mean, I think each of us have really interesting projects that will be part of continuing beyond raising awareness. And talking about marginalization and, being a minority in Hong Kong. And yeah, I think maybe
going to schools as well, right?
Yeah. We could possibly be taking, the comic project to schools and, the podcast is, global. So I think, there's definitely going to be a lot of different projects that will come under this big umbrella, this big research umbrella.
And so what I'm hearing is that we are working towards a future where the marginalized in our marginalized population studies group will disappear. And this is why we call ourselves 110%, because every single one of these stories create what we know today as Hong Kong, as our society, as our community, as our home. And so for all of you listening out there, smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, and get in touch with us if you want to collaborate. And we have a lot more to come. Thank you very much, everyone, and it's been a pleasure.